When people hear the word genocide, they usually think of the Holocaust. They think of Nazi Germany, concentration camps, and the horrors of the Second World War. But what if I told you that decades before Hitler came to power, Germany had already carried out a genocide? A genocide that killed tens of thousands of people. A genocide so devastating that it wiped out almost an entire population. A genocide that remains largely forgotten outside the country where it happens. This is a story of the Herero and Nama genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century. The story of how Germany's colonial ambitions turned a land dispute into one of the darkest chapters in African history, and how the events that unfolded in the deserts of Namibia continue to shape the country to this day. Long before European powers arrived, the land we now know as Namibia was once home to a number of indigenous communities. Among them were the Herero and Nama people. The Herero were primarily pastoralists, which means they built their society mostly around cattle. Wealth, status, and survival were all tied to their livestock. The Nama, meanwhile, occupied large parts of the southern region of Namibia and maintained their own traditions, leadership structures, and way of life. For centuries, these communities lived across a very harsh but beautiful landscapes, filled with vast deserts, open plains, and very scarce water sources. Life was not easy, but it was theirs. That would begin to change in the late 19th century. Across Europe, powerful nations were racing to claim territory overseas. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and others were carving up Africa in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Germany was a relatively new nation. Unified only in 1871, it had arrived late to the colonial competition. Its leaders feared being left behind. They wanted colonies of their own, and their eyes soon turned to Southwest Africa. In 1884, Germany declared the territory a protectorate. What would later become Namibia was renamed to German Southwest Africa. At first, German officials promised cooperation, but as more settlers arrived, the reality became really clear. The European colonists just wanted land, and lots of it. The best grazing land was gradually taken from the indigenous communities and were given to the German settlers. Cattle were seized, traditional authority was undermined, and the economic system that had existed for generations in what would later become Namibia were disrupted. Many Herero and Nama people found themselves pushed onto increasingly marginally smaller pieces of land. Others were forced into debt or labor arrangements that favored the German settlers, and because of that, tensions rose year after year. To German officials, the colony represented opportunity. To many indigenous people, it represented dispossession. By the beginning of the 20th century, conflict seemed almost inevitable, and by 1904, it had finally exploded. In January 1904, the Herero launched a rebellion against German rule. Frustrated by years of land seizures, discrimination, and exploitation, they attacked farms, military outposts, and infrastructure. The uprising caught the colonial authorities by surprise, and for a brief moment, it appeared that German control might be challenged. But Germany had no intention of losing its colony. Thousands of troops were dispatched to crush the rebellion. Among them was a man whose name would become synonymous with this brutality and this absolutely tragic genocide. His name was General Lothar von Throffer, sorry if I'm butchering that name. Born on the 3rd of July, 1848, his father was a commanding officer in the Persian army, meaning von Throffer had a very strict military upbringing by all accounts. Unlike some colonial administrators who favoured negotiation, Throffer believed only in overwhelming force to secure German rule. His objective was simple: destroy resistance completely, and he was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to achieve it. What happened next would change Namibia forever. A few months later, in August 1904, German forces were confronted by the Herero at Waterberg. The battle itself was very decisive. German troops outnumbered and outgunned their opponents. But victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. Rather than allowing survivors to surrender or retreat safely, German forces pushed them eastward, into one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, the Omaka Desert. Again, sorry for my pronunciation. Thousands of men, women, and children fled into this barren landscape, where water was really scarce and temperatures were extreme, and German soldiers controlled many of the remaining water sources in this desert. Some wells were guarded, and others were deliberately destroyed or poisoned. For the Herero, escape became a death sentence. Families wandered for days searching for water, and many never found it. Entire groups perished beneath the desert sun, and the worst was still yet to come, because General von Throffer had already decided that survival itself would not be permitted. On October 2nd, 1904, General von Throffer issued one of the most infamous orders in colonial history, known as the Extermination Order. It declared that the Herero people were no longer German subjects, and Throffer made his intentions very explicit. In his translation of the Extermination Order, he declared, "Every Herero, with or without a rifle, with or without cattle, will be shot." It was no longer a war against a rebellion. It had become a campaign against a group of people. It had become a genocide. Any Herero found within German territory would be shot. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. The objective was no longer to defeat a rebellion, but rather to eliminate an entire population. The order left little room for interpretation. German troops established a concord around the desert. Those attempting to return were driven back. Others were even killed. Meanwhile, thousands remained trapped in the desert, without water, without food, without shelter. Witnesses later described the horrific scenes they saw. They described families collapsing beside the dry river and children dying from dehydration. Entire groups disappeared into the sands, and many dead were never even counted. Their remains simply vanished into the desert. And by the time the extermination order was eventually withdrawn under international pressure, much of the damage had already been done. The Herero people had been shattered, but Germany's campaign was far from over. Despite the Nama people initially fighting alongside the Germans at Waterberg, the brutality inflicted upon the Herero did not go unnoticed. In late 1904, the Nama people launched their own rebellion against German rule. They had witnessed what happened to their neighbors, and they understood the threat they faced, and they chose to fight. Unlike the Herero, the Nama relied heavily on guerrilla tactics. They struck German positions and then disappeared into the landscape. For a time, they proved remarkably difficult to defeat. But Germany responded with some ruthless determination. They destroyed their villages and seized their livestock just like they did to the Herero people. And suspected rebels were executed. Thousands of Nama civilians were captured, and the war dragged on. Germany increasingly turned into a system that would become a grim preview of future atrocities, as we saw in World War II. And they created something: concentration camps. Like I said in the intro, when most people hear the term concentration camp, they think of Nazi Germany, but concentration camps existed decades before the Second World War. And some of the most notorious were located in German Southwest Africa. The most infamous was Shark Island. One of 5 concentration camps in the region, it was located near a coastal town of Luderitz. It was a little more than a windswept rock surrounded by freezing Atlantic waters. Prisoners were forced to live in crude shelters there, where food was extremely scarce and disease spread rapidly amongst those who were captured. Medical care was virtually non-existent, and survivors were subjected to forced labor. Many worked until they collapsed. Others even died from exposure, different illnesses, and malnutrition. Mortality rates were staggering. Some historians describe Shark Island as a death camp, and for those sent there, survival was often a matter of luck. Adding to the horror, some prisoners were subjected to racial experiments. Human remains were collected and shipped to Germany. Scientists used them to justify racist theories that were popular at the time, and the victims were treated not really as human beings, but more as objects, and the consequences would echo for generations in Namibia. By the time the violence subsided, the demographic impact was, for lack of better words, catastrophic. Before the conflict, the Herero population was estimated to be around 80,000 people. Afterwards, only 15,000 remained. Between 25 and 80% of the population had been wiped out. And the Nama people also suffered a devastating loss. Roughly half their population perished, being roughly 10,000 that died. Entire communities disappeared. The traditional leadership structures we spoke about earlier had completely collapsed, and the economic system was destroyed. Land ownership changed permanently, and what had begun as a colonial dispute over land and power had become one of the most devastating genocides of the 20th century. Yet, despite its scale, the world largely forgot it. Overshadowed by later wars and genocides, the events in Namibia rarely appeared in the history books, and for decades, many outside the country had never even heard of it. But Namibia itself never forgot. Following the genocide, Germany tightened its control over the colony. Survivors were stripped of their basic rights, and many were forced into labor systems that benefited colonial settlers. Large areas of the land that once belonged to the Herero and Nama people were transferred to the Europeans. The economic consequences were profound, and generations of indigenous communities lost access to wealth, resources, and their opportunities. The imbalance that was created during this colonial period did not disappear once the violence had ended. In many ways, it became embedded in the structure of society itself. Then, in 1915, another dramatic change occurred. During the First World War, German Southwest Africa was invaded by South African forces, and Germany lost control of the territory. But independence would remain a distant dream. For decades, Namibia remained under the South African administration, and only in 1990 did the country finally achieve its independence, for more than 80 years after the genocide began. For much of the 20th century, Germany avoided formally recognizing the events as a genocide. Activists, historians, and descendants of survivors continued to push for acknowledgement. They argued that what had happened was a definition of a genocide. An entire population had been deliberately targeted for destruction. Over time, international awareness grew, evidence accumulated, and historical consensus strengthened. And finally, in 2021, Germany officially recognized the killings of the Herero and Nama people as genocide.
It has taken nearly 6 years of talks, but today Germany is for the first time acknowledging that it committed genocide during its colonial rule in what is now Namibia in southern Africa. German troops massacred tens of thousands of Herero and Nama people between 1904 and 1908. Now, more than 100 years later, it has reached a deal with the government of Namibia on how to atone for the atrocities.
Along with paying 1.3 billion euros in reparations and aid. The announcement was widely seen as a significant moment, but it also sparked controversy. Many descendants of survivors argued that recognition alone was not enough. Questions about reparations, compensation, and historical justice remain subject of intense debate today. And more than a century later, the legacy of the genocide is still being negotiated. Today, the country is known for its breathtaking landscapes. The towering red dunes of the Namib Desert, the wildlife of Etosha, the rugged beauty of the Skeleton Coast. Each year, visitors travel from all around the world to experience one of Africa's most stunning destinations. But in 1904, thousands of Herero men, women, and children were driven into the Okahame, again I can't pronounce that, sorry, desert, where many died from thirst, starvation, and exhaustion. For decades, their story remained largely unknown outside Namibia. Overshadowed by the world wars and the later genocides, one of the first ever genocides of the 20th century was almost completely forgotten. Almost. Because while the world moved on, Namibia never did. And for more than a century, the debate over memory, responsibility, and justice continues. The genocide may have ended in 1908, but its legacy still shapes Namibia today. Thanks for listening.